Back in the day, they told us that if your espresso was 18 grams in and 36 grams out in 25 to 30 seconds, you were doing everything right. Well, they lied. Okay, that's a bit hyperbolic. They didn't lie, but since then, coffee science and new tools have shown us that these old rules, while fine for a dark roast Italian espresso in the 1990s, are just not good enough if you like specialty coffee and want to get the most out of those delicious beans. I've got 7 new rules of espresso that I'll show you in this video so you know what's changed about making espresso in the last few years and can get better coffee at home every day. So what should you start doing differently? Rule number 1 is that special magic timing. That 18 grams in and 36 grams out? Yeah, those aren't static, those are variables. Your 18-gram dose might be fine for some, even most coffees, and it's usually where I start. But you need to pay attention to what the beans are telling you and adjust if it will get you better espresso. For example, here is 18 grams of Ethiopian Yirgacheffe natural process, and here is 18 grams of Tanzanian black honey ground up in this little invisible 58mm portafilter thingy. You can see that the Tanzanian has more volume with the same weight, because the Ethiopian is denser, and so each bean weighs a little more. Of course, you'll need to adjust the dose with such a huge difference in volume, right? But how do you adjust the dose to make it better, not worse? Well, the rule I like to go by is when you've dosed into the portafilter and tamped it down, you are getting as close as possible to the shower screen, but not touching it. You can tell you're touching it by if you take your portafilter out after pulling your shot, there's an indent of the shower screen on the top. You might not see this before you pull your shot because water expands the coffee puck, so there's a little trial and error here. Figure out where that line is on your basket, and if you're using a bean that looks like it's a lot lower in your basket than your standard coffee, you might need to dose up a little bit to get the ideal amount of espresso out. Just remember to keep your ratio the same. If you go from 18 to 20 grams in, make sure to increase your yield from 36 to 40 grams out to keep this variable the same. Speaking of ratios, that's rule number 2. Adjust your ratios. If you're always going for a 1:2 ratio, you're probably not getting the most out of each bean. For a great example, I have this very tasty coffee from Runway Coffee Roasters, and as a 1:2 ratio, I just wasn't feeling it for espresso. So I bumped it up a little, doing 20 grams in and 50 grams out, so a 1 to 2.5 ratio instead, and that's when those flavors really started to sing. Now again, I still do start with a 1:2 ratio, but if I'm drinking it as pure espresso, I usually pull a longer shot called a lungo, and if I'm using it for milky drinks, I often pull a slightly shorter shot, a ristretto. Especially when doing latte art, a ristretto will be thicker and give better contrast for milky drinks, and somehow taste quite a bit stronger as well. Now, there's a simple trick I've been using for a few years to improve my shots, to adjust my grinder settings more consistently for new beans, and to develop my palate. So what's this trick, you ask? It's just keeping notes. What gets measured gets managed, and if you're just guessing at your settings every time you get a new bean, you're not going to improve at the critical skill of dialing in very quickly at all. For years, I drew lines in a notebook and charted out my coffee dial-in settings, but now I always have my new book, the Brew Ledger, on my bench. It's right here. This guy. It helps me to keep track of my shots, the grind, dose, and temperature settings I use, and my thoughts after I taste the shot as well. None of the tools or machines I'm talking about are sponsoring this video, so if you like my content, the best way to support this channel is to buy this book. There's a link in the description below. One of the big mistakes I see is people with all the good equipment, but who don't do a very important thing before tamping, and that's distributing the coffee. Check this out. I have a mound on one side and not much at all on the other side. If I tamp this down, what do you think is going to happen?
Awful, Charlie.
Distributing the coffee grounds in the portafilter will get us more evenly extracted and delicious coffee in the end. So if you're dosing straight into the portafilter, knocking on the side with your tamper, giving it a little squeeze, and then just locking it into the group and calling it a day, stop it. If you're not using dark roasted, oily beans, this lack of prep sets you up for channeling and nasty coffee. Now, I'm not telling you to go out and buy all the new expensive distributors. This is actually a pretty cheap upgrade if you know what to get. First, I grind into the dosing cup that came with my grinder, then transfer it into the portafilter. Some people use a blind shaker like this one, which evens out where the fine particles and coarse particles end up, rather than having lots of fines lumped in together at the end. Personally, I don't like them as they add extra faff to my process, but they are effective, so try one if you want to. I'll leave a link to one I got in the description. Then I almost always manually WDT with one of these things. I start by making little circles in the bottom of the basket and then slowly rotate up. Then I tap the portafilter down on a rubber mat to knock out any tiny air pockets. Then I tamp with a tamper that has a leveler of some kind to make sure that the water hits a bed that's flat so it extracts coffee evenly throughout. But what about those fancy schmancy tools that do this and that? I'll rate them all in a future video that I'm already working on. Most of the time before locking into the group, I'll use a puck screen as well. This helps with clean knockout and even dispersal of water through your coffee puck. They only cost a few pounds, and all you have to do is make sure to wash it and keep it clean so the holes don't get blocked up. With this simple process, I've massively improved my espresso, and especially for higher grade, light roasted specialty coffee, which you do not want to waste because you didn't distribute properly. Rule number 5 is actually more of a choice. A lot of older grinders had multi-purpose burrs, or just ones that weren't optimized specifically for espresso. The grinder manufacturer can't know in advance if you're going to be an espresso nut or a filter bro, so they just made burrs for the middle ground. But look at the difference between these two coffee burrs. How could they not make very different tasting coffee? Because blades like this will grind beans into a very different particle size and shape than blades like this. But how do you know which one you'll like? These boys are expensive, so unlike me, you can't go and get all of them just for testing. This is a complex topic, and I'm planning a video comparing them with the Vario VS6, which has a lot of burr options that are easy to switch out. Being super general here, but conical burrs with architecture like this will generally make a more velvety espresso. A flat burr like this will make more flavorful, punchy espresso with a little loss of texture. And multi-purpose fat burrs like this will make an espresso with less body, but a sharper, cleaner flavor. So if you like sharp flavors and high clarity, go for flat burrs that grind into shapes and sizes that pull out those flavors. And if you like texture, use conical burrs or flat burrs, with these kinds of flat burrs being a sort of middle ground that I personally find most appealing. The next rule sounds too nerdy for most people, but it's actually incredibly easy to do now and will make a massive difference to your espresso. If you're using tap water in your coffee, you have to taste it side by side with something like third wave water or another water solution. It's just not the same drink. Over 95% of your coffee is water, so if your local tap water has a bunch of pollutants and chlorine in it, you'll be getting all that rubbish in your espresso. That's why rule number 6 is to use good water. Companies like La Marzocco even recommend when they sell your machine to use bottled water like Crystal Geyser in your machine. Personally, I really like third wave water. I've noticed a big difference when switching over to their light roast solution, which I just mix in with distilled water in a 2-litre jug. To distill my water, I just use this jug from Zero Water, which has a filter. It's not very expensive and removes most of the crap from my hard British tap water. There are other solutions like Lotus Water, mixing it up yourself, or using a water filter like the Brita one I have under my bar for the plumbable espresso machine I still don't have. The next thing that started to become much more common in espresso machines is temperature control. I remember having an aftermarket PID on my Rancilio Silvia back in the day, and the extra control that gave me to extract a coffee fully was insane. Because here's the reality: if you're using an old heat exchange machine or a budget machine without temperature control, you are going to have wildly different tasting coffee shot to shot. Even 2 or 3 degrees Celsius difference in temperature is going to have a massive effect. Just look at the extraction percentages of this same coffee. Same grind size and everything, but one of them is brewed at 92 degrees and one at 96. That's over 12.3% extraction versus only 10.4, which is a massive difference just from one variable. So that's why I made rule number 7 that you adjust your temperature for each bean. But how do you control the temperature to improve the coffee rather than just guessing? Here's my decision matrix, and in general, I keep this range to between 90 and 96 Celsius, with the average coffee generally being best at 94. That's where I usually start. Ideally, opt to get your grinder settings right first. Once you've got that, I start by looking at the roast level, as this is the first thing I adapt to, and I usually adjust this before even pulling my first shot with a new bean. If the coffee's light roasted, generally speaking, I'll need to apply more heat to extract more out of the coffee. This is because in the process of roasting coffee darker, the integrity of the bean is greatly reduced, so more coffee solids can be pulled out of the bean more easily. If you use a higher temperature and extract dark roasted coffee even more quickly, you're likely to get some very harsh or bitter flavors. Next, I consider what altitude the coffee is grown at, as this is one of the most important elements. The higher the coffee is grown at, the higher I go with my temperature. The highest altitudes for coffee growing are usually from Ethiopia, where the Yirgacheffe and Guji regions are very mountainous and have coffee grown up to 2,300 meters above sea level. The highlands of Colombia also get very high elevations as well. Brazilian coffee tends to be much lower, and I think I once had a Hawaiian Kona that was grown at like 200 meters above sea level, but don't quote me on that, my memory sucks. The higher elevation the coffee is grown at, the less oxygen there is in the atmosphere, and so the beans tend to become denser and smaller, though this also depends on the variety and the growing region. Lastly, I look at the process. Natural processed coffee tends to require a little less heat than washed processed coffee does. Conversely, if you're using a decaf, these tend to have very low structural integrity because of the processing method stripping the bean of its caffeine. That'll mean bringing your temperature down, and for some decafs I'll go below 92 degrees if I'm still getting harsh or bitter flavors after dialing in correctly. I'm doing a video soon on the new CR3 decaffeinating process, which I'm very excited about, so make sure you're subscribed because that video is going to be coming out very soon. If you line up all those variables, you should quickly find an ideal temperature to brew your espresso at. And if you're keeping notes, like I do, in your brew ledger, you'll start to notice these patterns more easily as well. Now, if you're still having trouble pulling a good espresso shot, watch this video right here. That should help you get the most out of your home espresso machine. Thanks so much for watching, you wonderfully over-caffeinated people, and I'll see you on the next one.